Okay, welcome back. So this is part 2 of the chapter 3 video. In this section, we're going to talk about supply as opposed to demand, and then a little bit about how supply and demand work together. So demand was the consumer or the buyer side of the market. Supply is the sellers or producers side of the market. A lot of the things that we discussed before will still apply here, or they're similar. So just like we said, demand is a relationship between two things. Supply is as well. Supply is a relationship between price, meaning the price that you can get when you sell your product, and the amount that you're willing to produce, or the quantity supplied. So really, supply is mostly about the marginal cost of production, the cost of producing the item. And the idea here is not quite as obvious, I think, as it is with demand, but the idea is that businesses at some point face increasing costs of production. If you try to produce more and more goods with fixed resources, your costs begin to go up at some point. And so the only way you're going to be willing to produce beyond that point as your costs go up is if people will pay you a higher price. So that's what explains supply. It's a positive relationship in which, as the price that you can get for your product goes up, you will work harder and incur those higher costs in order to supply more. So that's the law of supply. It's a positive relationship, saying as price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. As price goes down, businesses are going to produce less because they're going to say, hey, it's too costly to make that. Maybe I'll switch over and do something different. So that's kind of the idea. Just like with demand, supply is never a single number. A single number is probably a quantity supplied, which is a particular quantity at a certain price or one point on a supply curve. But supply is the relationship as a whole. Just like with demand, supply can be shown as an equation like this one, a table like this one, or a graph. And again, all these numbers sort of correspond. Most of the time in this class, we're going to be using graphs. So for reasons we just discussed, a supply curve will have a positive slope because of that positive relationship that the law of supply tells us, meaning as price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. Okay, just like with demand, there are things that will cause a shift in the supply curve. They actually move the supply curve to the right or the left. I want to stress to you first, when we think about increase and decrease, think of increase as meaning you're moving to the right. You're moving right to a bigger quantity, not, don't think of it as up and down, because if you shift a supply curve up, it's really going to the left to a lower quantity. So increase means it's moving to the right, decrease means moving to the left. So continuing with our Coke example, some things would change the supply curve for Coke would be Coke builds several new factories. That just allows them to make more. Technological advance that would make Coke cheaper to produce, or the cost of aluminum, which they use in their cans, or high fructose corn syrup falls. So you can see, if you think about that, remember I said the supply is about the cost of production. All these things are things that would affect the cost of production. So if you want the more general categories, here's the list of things that will shift supply. You'll need these when you do your exercise on this chapter. Prices of factors of production. So remember, factors of production are labor, capital, natural resources. If the prices of any of those change, it changes a company's cost of production. That shifts supply. Anything that makes it cheaper to produce pushes supply out to the right. If it makes it more expensive to produce, it pushes it to the left. Returns from alternative activities. So that's referring to a company that makes more than one product. So if you make, Coke makes Coke, but they also have Dasani bottled water. So those are two different products that they make. I had a student recently who had a business that basically did two things. They put roofs on, they did roofing, and they poured foundations. And he told me a story about a few years ago after a big storm. Lots of people had roof damage. All of a sudden, there was this big demand for roofing jobs. People were willing to pay anything for roofing, and guess what? It makes perfect sense. They quit doing foundations because the price of doing a foundation hadn't changed. Prices from roofing were literally through the roof, so they spent all their resources doing the more productive activities. So that's kind of how that one works. Technology. technology can affect cost of production pretty obviously, so that should make sense. Seller expectations, that's kind of like the buyer expectations on the demand side. So businesses might expect different market conditions in the future, so they might ramp up supply today to get ready for that or something like that. Natural events, so those would be like natural disasters mostly, and those really would affect prices of factors of production. So, if a drought kills all the potato fields in northern Maine, that shifts the supply of potatoes into the left. And then just the number of sellers in the market. So that's the one here that doesn't really deal directly with the cost of production for a company, but it's just saying that if there are more sellers at any given price, more of that product will be produced. So more sellers shift supply to the right, fewer shifts it to the left. Okay, so now let's finally put supply and demand together. You'll get used to seeing this demand curve, supply curve. This magic point here is called equilibrium. And equilibrium is this perfect price where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. So it's the precise price where the amount that consumers want to buy happens to be exactly the amount that businesses want to produce. It's pretty unrealistic. We are rarely right at equilibrium, but I like to think of it more like cruise control in your car. If you set that cruise control in 70, you're not going 70 miles per hour all the time. Your car kind of speeds up and it goes up maybe to 72, and then there's some automatic mechanism that makes it slow down, and the speed drops back a little bit to 68, goes back and forth, but it hovers around 70, but it's magically drawn back to that level. That's kind of how equilibrium works. We're rarely right at equilibrium, but there are forces in the economy that tend to bring us back toward equilibrium. Okay, so markets not in equilibrium. A little confused here. Markets not in equilibrium either have a shortage or a surplus. And shortage just means that the price is too low, it's below equilibrium, so that the quantity demanded is way out here, the quantity supplied is way back here. So if quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, you have a shortage. If it's the other way around, quantity supplied is higher than quantity demanded, that's a surplus. You can probably figure out already what happens. If we're in a situation where there's a shortage, what happens normally in the market? The price goes up. So as that price goes up, these quantities come closer and closer together, and we're drawn back toward equilibrium. So that's one of those automatic forces. Okay, shifts in demand. So in your exercise for this chapter, I'm going to give you a whole bunch of scenarios like this. You've got picture a graph of supply and demand in equilibrium. I'll give you a scenario like this one. Assume there's a bumper crop of wheat and it drives down wheat prices. What happens in the pizza market? So the first thing you have to ask yourself is this a change in supply, like cost of production, or is it a change in demand and consumers' willingness to buy? Well, in this case, I think it's pretty clearly about the cost of production. Okay. Then ask yourself, just to be sure, which shifter is it? So if you can pick one of the lists, one of the supply shifters off that list, you know you've picked correctly that it really is a supply change, not a demand change. In this case, this is a change in prices of factors of production. So that's on our supply list. Good. Direction of the shift. So this made it cheaper to produce pizza. That's going to push supply to the right. And as more pizza is produced at a lower production cost, the market price should also decrease. So that's how you'd work yourself through a situation like that. Here's one more. I hope I have time for it. The scenario now is it's Friday night in a college dorm. Lots of beer has been consumed by residents. What happens in the pizza market relative to earlier nights? I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to hurry through this. That's a demand change. I'm saying pizza and beer are complements. Demand increases and price increases. So here's just a little hint for exercise 3.1. Here are my answers to the first one. Graphic change is D, which means number of sellers has changed. So